to our YouTube channel, where wisdom meets inspiration. In this channel, we share valuable insights to help you become the best version of yourself. Our content is designed to uplift your spirit and enrich your life. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay connected with this incredible journey. Click the subscribe button below.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is a mind on a diet. This is a phrase I have borrowed from an essay I read more than 20 years ago. And that essay was on concentration. And the idea behind the essay was that we are spread so thin nowadays with innumerable ideas and information coming from all sides, most of which we don't really need, that the mind becomes incapable of concentrating. And last Sunday, in the last satsang, when we saw how concentration is so important, because it's the forgetfulness that causes most of the problems and difficulties and challenges that we have in life. And hence that essay had this phrase that in order for us and the concentration to become easier in our lives, we should allow the mind to go on a diet. And as we know, when you read something and a certain phrase or a word or an idea kind of resonates with you, then the mind keeps on churning that in the head and thinking about all your earlier ideas and the thinking to see what comes out of it. And so this idea of a mind on a diet I found it interesting enough, and partly because then you begin to think about what does going on a diet mean. We normally associate the idea of going on a diet with food and is related to health. And going on a diet usually involves that we take matters of food seriously, be on watch regarding what food goes inside and how much of it, and make sure that the food that we eat contributes towards our health and well-being and not their opposite. But we have also seen that the word food can be understood in more than one ways. Of course, we all know what food is. The Sanskrit word for food, one of the ways the word food gets expressed in Sanskrit is ahara. And ahara, literally translated, means that which is taken in. And there is this passage which I quoted on earlier occasions as well from the Chandogya Upanishad, which says, ahara shuddhau sattva shuddhau dhruva spritihi lambhe sarvagrantinam vipramokshaha. Which means, literally translated, when the food is pure, our mind becomes pure. When the mind is pure, the memory becomes strong and stable. And when the memory is thus acquired, all the knots of the heart are removed. And so food, as we have seen on earlier occasions, has always played an important role in religion and spirituality. And depending on how we understand the word food, the different practices related to food have evolved in different ways in different traditions and in the lives of different people. Now, food is, of course, that which we take in through the mouth, and it would seem as if it primarily deals with the sense of taste, and it does. But we also know that food can be enjoyed not simply through taste, although that might seem to be the primary sense through which we enjoy food. But sometimes when we have a meal presented in a very artistic way, not just kind of just poured something and dumped in front. So something when it is beautifully presented, at sometimes in some good restaurants they do, it's visually very pleasing. So it's the sense of sight that also enjoys the food, not just the taste. And of course, we generally tend to use spoons and fork and so on, which really deprives the sense of touch. In many other parts of the world, in India and Asia, others, I didn't grow up using a spoon and fork. I had to learn it after I came to the West. And so you actually come in direct contact with the food. And sometimes just the texture of the food gives a sense of more relating yourself to the food that you are eating. So the sense of touch also gets a kind of enjoyment by just being in touch with the food. And if the food, if the food is crunchy, then your sense of hearing also sometimes. So now the food that goes in is enjoyed by the body. But as we've seen, the other senses also, that enjoyment that goes in through the senses really is an enjoyment for the mind. And so when we take in food, we have to also think not just about the body, but about the mind as well. But we also know it's not just the sight and the taste and the touch with food, but also the senses take in ideas and information and so many other things, which nourishes, just as food nourishes the body, the ideas and information and the things that we get, the insights that we get from different sources nourishes the mind. And so when we think about food and diet, the mind on a diet would really mean the kind of care we might sometimes take about the food to take care of the body. Are we taking a similar kind of care about the mind, the food that goes into the mind through the instrumentality of the senses? When we speak about the body and the mind, of course, it's good to always remind ourselves of what role these parts of our personality play in our life. Clearly, the body is the most visible part of who we are, but we also know that we are not just the body. We know that there are more subtler parts of our personality which are not as visible as the body. All the things that for instance, the mind, the intellect, the ego, our thoughts, emotions, feelings, none of these things are as tangible as the body is, but they are very much a part of who we are. And so the mind plays also an important part in our own constitution. Sometimes the mind and the brain get equated in our heads, but it's again good to remind ourselves that the brain is a physical part, is a part of our body. The mind is not a part of this visible, tangible body. So the way Vedanta understands it, the mind and the brain are not one and the same. When the body dies, eventually, the brain being part of the body will also die. And there is, of course, in different parts of the world, the definition of death also varies. When is someone legally dead? When the heart stops functioning or the brain stops functioning? But eventually, sooner or later, both are going to stop functioning. But the mind, the way it's understood in Vedanta, is not a part of this tangible body. And therefore, what survives death is the mind. And of course, the spirit, the Atman, which is indestructible. And therefore, it's good to keep that distinction between the mind and the brain in our heads. because the two seem to be connected in some way, because what happens in the mind seems to have some changes occurring in the brain, and that's what science can measure. What is quantifiable or what is measurable, what is perceivable, are the kind of electrochemical changes that might occur in the brain. And because of that correlation, we might be sometimes deluded into thinking that's all that happens. So our emotions, our feelings, our ideas can't be reduced to simply some activity occurring here. But there is a correlation, and of course there's a much study that happens about that. Correlation should not be misunderstood, must not be thought of as a causation. And so there's always this debate about what affects. Is the brain, changes in the brain affect the mind, or the changes in the mind affect the brain? And there is much debate about that. But it's good to also keep in mind, because they are two distinct entities, that just because there is something wrong in the brain, that does not automatically should not lead to the conclusion that something is wrong with the mind as well. And vice versa. That if there is some problem in the mind, that doesn't necessarily mean there is some problem in the brain. So that distinction has to be kept in mind. Having said that, in Vedanta they see that both body and mind, both are material. One is, of course, gross, tangible matter, which we can perceive through the senses that we have. And the mind is very subtle. But just because it is subtle, it doesn't make it anything different from a material object. I mean, it's like, what to speak about the mind? Even an isolated electron is a material particle. And the mind is even subtler than even an electron. So the mind and body both are material. And this fact, which modern medicine since the last few decades has come to acknowledge and appreciate the fact, which is why they say majority of our illnesses tend to be psychosomatic. And we know that from our own experience. When the body is not doing well, and if it continues for a sustained amount of time, it tends to affect the mind. And if the mind is not doing well, it tends to affect the body. So we know that they two are connected. The Indian system of medicine, Ayurveda, recognized this truth years ago, thousands of years ago. And so they did not make much difference between the body and mind. And so when we think about the mind going on a diet or taking care of the mind, that would also imply taking care of the body. So the three factors we need when we think about in matters of diet is, first, our awareness that we need it. Secondly, the kind of food and its quantity that we must take in, and the quality of food. Now, in terms of the food that we eat daily, we pretty much understand what this means. But exactly the same criteria applies to the food that goes in through the mind as well. So among the different problems that can occur when that which is taken in is not processed well. So one of the difficulties clearly that some of us sometime or the other may have experienced is indigestion. And we know that just as undigested food can create trouble in the body, undigested food of the mind can create trouble in the mind. Sometimes the kind of conflicts that we have, the stress and anxieties that we experience, can be understood in terms of indigestion. And one of the ways that our lives get impacted is through just this experience of the past and the future. And of course, present is where we are. If we just lived in the present, life would be actually great. But none of us, very few of us are able to just live in the present. In fact, most of the time, most of us are either being sucked back into the past or being pulled into the future. Now, what takes us back to the past is clearly the experiences that we have had. Now, every day, from morning to night, we have hundreds of different experiences. Everything that we see and hear is making some impression. That's an experience. But it's not that all of these experiences are troubling. Most of these experiences just are, if they are no longer troubling me, that means I've digested them. But we know that there are some of the things from our own past which we can never forget. And these are the things that trouble us. Even when we want to enjoy the present, some of the things that may have happened yesterday or last week or last year or even 10 years ago, sometimes even 50 years ago, or sometimes what may have happened to my parents or my grandparents, these are the things which have happened in the past, come and trouble me in the present. And which is why I'm not able to enjoy the present, because these memories of the past come and kind of vitiate my present. Similarly, the future intrudes into the present as well. And the future intrudes in terms of the anxiety sometimes we might have, the uncertainty. Sometimes, or quite often actually, we live in uncertain times. There is, of course, the financial market, and there are these policies and the different leaders have. And this can be troubling. And one worries about how things will be going forward 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 10 years from now. So worrying about the future also deprives us of enjoying the present. Swami Vivekananda once said that time is but the method of our thinking. We are the eternal present tense. So if we begin to think about it, past and future really are just mental constructs. For tomorrow, for instance, now, as we located right now today at this moment, we can think about tomorrow being the future and what happened yesterday as the past. But just exactly a few hours from now, then tomorrow has become today. So tomorrow becomes the present, and what is today present becomes the past. So it's a constantly moving goalpost, if you like, of what is past and future. And yet, something that doesn't have stability seems to control our life so much. So the question, therefore, is, how do we truly live? And the answer is only by digesting our past and finding ways to not worry about the future. And that's where this idea of digestion comes in. So we might say, which are the kind of things of the past that trouble us? And one way of understanding all of our experiences in life is that every experience I have is meant to teach me something. And if I have learned what that experience has to teach me, that nourishes me, I become strong, and it doesn't bother me anymore. It's just like the food that we eat. Whatever food that we eat, if it is nourishing, I digest it, it makes me strong, it doesn't bother me. But if I eat something that is not nourishing, that I'm not able to digest, then it remains like a foreign body inside, and then it starts troubling me. Same thing with regard to experiences we have. That those experiences which we get, in fact, whatever maturity and wisdom that we have acquired as a result of our experiences is because we have digested all the pleasant and unpleasant things that have happened in our life. But there are certain things which we haven't yet digested. And those are the things that we keep on playing and replaying in our heads. And so digesting those experiences would mean, in one way at least, going back and reliving, at least mentally, those things and asking oneself, what was I supposed to learn from that experience? And once I'm able to figure out, yes, this is what I have learned from that experience, it will no more bother me, because then it has made me stronger. But so long as I have not figured that out, some of these experiences, usually very traumatic or painful experiences of the past, which we are not able to forget, is because we have not digested them. And therefore, indigestion is a big problem. And that's why going on a diet oftentimes helps in that. So the first thing would be clearly what we do to avoid indigestion is avoid junk food. And so most of us are very conscious nowadays about what we take in. But we probably may not be exercising equal amount of care about what we taking in through the senses. And so avoiding junk would mean being careful about what my eyes take in, what kind of sounds my ears hear, and so on. Now we might say, well, if the eye is open, then it's just going to take in whatever is in front of it. If the ears are open, it's going to take in whatever sounds. We cannot really have a total control over this unless you kind of go to a forest or on a mountaintop or sit in a cave to decide what my senses are going to take in. But living in a busy city like this, we can't totally control what the senses are going to take in. But we can try to have some amount of control over it through understanding where should I focus my attention on, which are the kind of places I should frequent, what are the kind of books I should read, which are the kind of movies I should see, which are the kind of television programs I should watch, what kind of friends I should have, what kind of conversations I should engage in. Because it is through all of these different ways that these ideas and images and sounds are going to enter into me. So while we cannot stop or control it fully, we do have some measure of control over the kind of things we want our mind to absorb through the senses. And we understand it, there is nothing very philosophical about it. It's just pure common sense. And most of us have heard this right from the time we were little children. The advice our parents or our elders in the family gave, urging us to have good friends, read good books, and so on. The reason was the kind of food that will be given to the mind that will be nourishing. So just as we need a healthy body, we'll have a healthy mind as well. And so one other thing about digestion is about knowledge itself. So there are two kinds of knowledge. It's possible to look upon knowledge as at least of two kinds. One is what we might say intellectual knowledge or information. And the other is empirical or experiential knowledge. And two things are different. I can read a whole article on milk in Wikipedia or some book on it and know a lot about milk. And I will have some knowledge about what milk is and its chemical composition and all of that. But then actually drinking a cup of milk gives me a different kind of knowledge. So one is considered experiential knowledge, actually having drunk the milk. The other is about the ideas and information related to milk. And both are important. So when we go to school, when we read all these books, most of the information we get in schools is related to ideas and information. So it's intellectual, it's theoretical. But sometimes that theoretical knowledge, there isn't much time to then immediately test it, immediately experience it. And that's sometimes that disconnect between the theoretical knowledge that we have and the experiential knowledge that we lack sometimes creates a problem. It does even more, especially in spiritual life, because sometimes everything is kind of a mixed blessing. So in very ancient days, before even paper and printing and all of those things were there, it wasn't easy to get knowledge. In order to get knowledge, you had to actually physically go find the teacher and learn directly from the teacher. There was no, forget about the internet, there weren't even books that time. And so the only way was to depend totally on a learned teacher to share their wisdom. And then when the students learned that, then these students eventually became teachers. They passed it on to the next generation. And so getting knowledge was not easy in very old days. Today, it's a lot easier because clearly now you don't even need to go to your computer and your desktop. People are carrying these little computers with them in their pockets. And so accessibility to knowledge is much, much better. Now, which is a good thing. But along with every good thing also comes some challenges. And the challenge is this. In the very ancient times, as we read in these books, since the student completely depended on the teacher to give the lessons, the teacher could control the flow of knowledge, if you like. In other words, just think about it this way. The teacher gives the first lesson and then asks the student, not just memorize it, but practice it. Practice what that lesson gets. And the teacher does not give the second lesson until the student in some form practices what was learned in that first lesson. So, learning something, getting an intellectual knowledge, theoretical knowledge is good. But then when I practice it, then a certain amount of refinement occurs in the mind. And so when the teacher gives the second lesson, I'm now getting that second lesson with a mind which is a little bit more refined as a result of practicing the first lesson. So then the teacher waits. And then I practice what the wisdom of that second lesson is. My mind becomes even more mature. Then the third lesson. So the idea is the theoretical knowledge went in step with the practical experience of the student. Today what happens is, because everything is so easily accessible, we find that we can buy any number of books. You don't even need to carry the books. Now it's all in your small tablet. You can have an entire library. And so there is a lot to read, a lot to process, but we keep on reading. We have a lot more theoretical understanding about the world, but also about the Atman and the Gita and the Upanishads. We can keep on reading and get a measure of understanding, intellectual understanding. But our experience, we probably may not have experienced any of what we have read. And that can be a challenge, especially if we are not careful. Then not only will we not understand, if we don't understand what we read, we are safe. But if we misunderstand, that's a problem, because we think we have understood, but we have understood it wrongly. And oftentimes, learning something new is far easier than unlearning something wrong. And that is the problem. And that's how this indigestion can occur in that way as well. And so we have to be more judicious, especially as spiritual seekers, about what books I'm reading. Because indiscriminate reading, and it's not as if some books are good and bad. I'm not making such a stark contrast between good and bad. Maybe there are 10 books, all of them are good. But what can happen is that some of these insights they're coming from different viewpoints, and in itself that should be wonderful. But the problem is, if my mind hasn't become mature enough or hasn't acquired that enough refinement, then seeing these 10 different views and me having no experience, no practice, I'm just going to get more confused. So rather than being a help, it is in fact going to be a problem. That is why a theoretical understanding of something has to go side by side, alongside an actual practice. That is what Swami Vivekananda said, that an ounce of practice is worth hundreds of tons of theory. So again, some of the things we have often alluded to before about non-dualism, dualism, and sometimes it's put in a kind of an evolutionary way, and people sometimes tend to feel that non-dualism, Advaita, is like the pinnacle of philosophical abstraction, and dualism is like by default everyone is dualistic. There's much that can be said about that, but it's good to keep one statement which I found. One of the disciples of Ramakrishna said that. He said that a dualist with experience is better than a non-dualist with no experience. And so it might seem very intellectually stimulating. We're talking about all these oneness and abstraction, but at the end of the day, they're just words. It's so much better to just see exactly right now, at this very moment, how do I see myself? At this very moment, when I think of God, let me not just remember what I read in this book or that book, but what is my idea about this infinite being or reality? How do I see it? Again, the word infinity, the word omnipresent, they're great words, but ultimately they're just words. How does my mind try to grasp the truth behind my own existence, the truth behind this world that I encounter? That questioning oneself, yes, using the insights that we have read and heard from everywhere, but also then trying to figure out for oneself something much closer to heart than simply stimulating of the intellect. So indigestion has to be understood in that respect as well. And that is why we should be careful about what kind of ideas we allow to enter inside. It's not as simple as simply pressing the delete button. Because at least the food that we eat through the mouth, if it is not good, sometimes a good laxative can take care of it. But there isn't an easy laxative for the rubbish that has gone inside our head. It's not so easy. And so that which is already gone, we have to figure out what to do with it. But the first thing to do is not allow more junk to go in. So at least going forward, even if we have been careful up to this point, we have to be even more careful about what I'm going to allow to feed. Our mind shouldn't be converted into just kind of a dumping ground. And and especially again, most of what I'm saying would make sense, especially if you are serious about spiritual life. And then the second problem is about eating, about diet, is overeating. So just as overeating can create trouble, taking in more ideas that we can digest can be troublesome as well. Swami Vivekananda once said, "To me, the very essence of education is concentration of the mind, not the collecting of facts. If I had to do my education over again and had any voice in the matter, I would not study facts at all. I would develop the power of concentration and detachment, and then with a perfect instrument, I could collect facts at will." And I know in the highly secularized environment in which we live, this may not be possible today, but it's instructive to remember that in the Vedic times, when a student went to the teacher's home to study, the very first lesson was really a prayer. And the first prayer, or the most ancient prayer in the tradition, was the Gayatri. And the Gayatri prayer is primarily about opening up the latent faculties of the mind. And this is exactly what Swami Vivekananda is saying here, that the mind is a great instrument. Once I know how to operate that instrument and I refine it, then with the help of that instrument, I can use it to study any subject anywhere. And so the rush to get facts before we are able to digest them creates all the trouble. There is this story, many of you probably have heard about it, how it comes in the Zen tradition. One student goes to a Zen master and says, "Will you please accept me as your student?" The teacher says, "Let's first have some tea." So the makes the student sit. He takes 2 cups of tea. The teacher goes and fixes tea and then comes in a kettle and starts pouring that tea into that student's cup. And he keeps on pouring even when that cup has become full. And the tea is overflowing and spilling all over the place. And the teacher doesn't stop. And the student is horrified. Then he finally can't stop himself. And so he tells the teacher, "Stop. Why are you keeping on pouring? The cup is full. It can't hold any more tea." Then the teacher stops, looks at the students and says, "Your head is like that." In other words, it's already so much filled with junk that I cannot teach you. Whatever I teach you is going to overflow the way this tea is overflowing. And that's what I meant earlier, that if you're already filled, it's a little bit like sometimes. Nowadays, of course, computers have lots of storage space. But there was a time, sometimes if there isn't enough storage, after something you'll say, "No more, delete some files before you can store some more material there." Something like that occurs. The brain is not infinite. It's still a physical organ. And so if it is just filled with all useless information, then there won't be place in it for something useful. And so finally, then rounding it up, that's the reason why a dieting might help. A fasting might help also. Just as we know that fasting helps our physical health, occasional fasting for the mind would be helpful. Come to think of it, the daily practice that we have, most of us, when we pray and meditate and do japa morning and evening, is a kind of an intermittent fasting, if we do it well. Because when we are fasting, or when we are meditating and praying, that is the time we need to be thinking only of the divine, only of the object of our meditation, nothing else. And that's why we find a quiet spot and so on. So we don't want any useless sound, we don't want any useless sights. The mind is fasting. We are telling the mind, you're going to get only one type of sound, the sound of your prayer, the sound of the mantra. You're just going to get one visual, the form, the divine form on which you are meditating. And total fasting from everything else. And so if we do that well, then we are kind of on a daily diet, at least for a few minutes in the morning and evening. Now, if we want to be if you're a little bit more ambitious and want to find a greater benefit from it, and depending on your own schedule and the situation, it might be helpful. Even say one day in a week, even if you can't do it a whole day, let's say a morning or an evening, that if you are brave and courageous enough to switch off your cell phone, your television, and just say, I'm not going to take any calls, and just be by yourself. it'll be a fascinating experience, because that's, if I can cut myself off from everything, even if it's for just an hour or two, we will know a lot more about ourselves than we have known. The tragedy of the times in which we live today is that we know a lot more about what's happening in distant parts of the world, what's happening with these celebrities. That information we have more than what's really going on in our own inner lives. So we are totally ignorant about what's going on here, and perhaps more knowledgeable. So we know sometimes more about the lives of other people around us and very little about our own life. And if we want to kind of reintroduce ourselves to ourselves, then this occasional fasting would be very helpful. So these are some of the thoughts that come to mind when we think about a mind going on a diet. The relevance of food, what's food for the body, what's food for the mind, what are the kind of difficulties that the body can get from junk food, and the kind of difficulties the mind can get from the junk that goes in through the senses, and what we can do to not only have a healthy body, but also a healthy mind. In fact, years ago, when I was in Chennai, in India, we published a volume on health, and we did not restrict it only to physical health. In fact, the book that came out later with that was titled "A Healthy Mind, Healthy Body." And so it's good. In order to have a wholesome personality, we should have both a healthy body, a healthy mind. And only then the spirit within will shine forth, when we are mindful about, before we go about solving the problems of the world, there are a lot of problems that need solving right here in our own hearts. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhum.